All right, so buckle up because today we're going underground.
Ooh, sounds exciting.
It is. We're talking about the Kentucky Cave Wars.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I've heard about those.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild chapter of American history, right?
Yeah.
Like, picture this. We're talking rivalries, we're talking sabotage, even shootouts, all for control of these incredible caves.
Yeah, it really captures the imagination, doesn't it? This battle for these hidden underground worlds.
It really does, and I think it speaks to this kind of deeper fascination we have with caves, right? Like, they're mysterious, they're beautiful, they're kind of dangerous.
Right, exactly. And in this case, they were also big business.
Okay, so let's back up a bit for anyone who isn't familiar with this whole saga.
Mhm.
We're talking about the Kentucky Cave Wars,
Mhm.
mainly taking place in the early 20th century. And at the heart of it all is Mammoth Cave.
Of course, Mammoth Cave, I mean, this is the big one, right? The longest known cave system in the world.
Exactly. Hundreds of miles of underground passages and chambers. It's mind-boggling.
It is, and it had already been a tourist attraction for decades before the cave wars really showed it up.
Right? People were drawn to its beauty, the massive chambers, the formations, those crazy stalactites and stalagmites.
Oh, yeah, and the flow stone, it's like frozen waterfalls underground, just incredible.
And for the indigenous peoples of the area, it wasn't just a tourist spot, right?
No, not at all. Mammoth Cave held deep spiritual and cultural significance for them. For thousands of years, it was a sacred space, a source of resources, a place woven into their very history.
So we have this natural wonder steeped in history, and then in the early 1900s, things start to get, well, competitive.
Yeah, you could say that.
What were the major factors that kind of kicked off this whole cave war frenzy?
Well, I think you can point to a couple of key things. One was the arrival of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. Suddenly, the Mammoth Cave region was way more accessible to tourists.
Right, like before that, it was a long, bumpy journey by horse and buggy.
Exactly, but with the railroad, you could get there in relative comfort, and that brought in a whole new wave of visitors.
And more visitors mean more money, more opportunity.
Right, and that's where the second factor comes in the rise of the automobile. More people owning cars meant even more folks could reach these more remote areas.
So now we have this perfect storm brewing. You've got increased accessibility, a booming tourist industry, and what happens?
Well, people start to realize, hey, there are other caves out there. Maybe I can get a piece of this action.
So it becomes a gold rush, but for caves?
Exactly. Everyone's looking to strike it rich, and suddenly you have all these new caves being discovered and developed, all vying for attention and tourist dollars.
And that's when things start to get, let's say, a little less than gentlemanly.
It got cutthroat, to say the least. We're talking about road signs being altered to mislead tourists, rival cave owners spreading rumors and lies about each other.
Wow, talk about bad for business.
Oh, it was, and it went even further. There were cases of vandalism, caves being damaged, even reports of actual violence.
I read about that, like actual shootouts between rival cave operators.
Yeah, it sounds crazy, but it really happened. These guys were serious about protecting their turf, their claim to these underground treasures.
We have some sources describing these cave cappers.
Oh yeah, the cave cappers, those were a unique breed.
What exactly did they do?
Well, imagine you're a tourist. You've traveled all this way to see Mammoth Cave, and as you're approaching the area, this guy in a cap pops out from the side of the road, waving a pamphlet in your face, and he
Wow.
starts telling you all these stories, right? Like, Mammoth Cave is closed today, or it's dangerous, there's been a collapse, or even, I know a secret entrance to an even bigger and better cave, just follow me.
So they were like these con men trying to lure tourists away from the competition.
Exactly, and they were pretty good at it too. They knew how to play on people's fears, their curiosity, and their desire to get the most out of their trip.
It's amazing how far people were willing to go, right? Like these elaborate schemes and deceptions, all for a piece of the cave tourism pie.
It really is, and it shows how quickly things can escalate when there's money to be made, especially when you're dealing with something as unique and alluring as these caves.
So we've got this whole cast of characters, these rival cave owners, all trying to outdo each other. Were there any key players that really stand out in this whole saga?
Oh yeah, definitely. You can't talk about the Kentucky Cave Wars without mentioning George Morrison. He was a real character, a shrewd businessman who owned and operated a cave he called New Mammoth Cave.
New Mammoth Cave, was that like some kind of knockoff version of the real deal?
Well, that's kind of what the original Mammoth Cave folks thought, and they were not happy about it. Morrison was constantly trying to one-up them, and he wasn't afraid to bend the rules or even break them to get ahead.
What kind of things did he do?
Oh, you name it. He bribed Mammoth Cave employees to get access to restricted areas. He spread rumors about their cave, and then he pulled off this incredible stunt.
What did he do?
He literally blasted his own entrance into the Mammoth Cave system through a sinkhole on his property. Can you believe that?
Wow, he just blew his way in.
He did, and then he had the audacity to advertise it as the new entrance to Mammoth Cave, like it was some kind of improvement.
That's bold, to say the least. Did it work?
Well, it certainly got people talking, and to his credit, he did make some significant discoveries in the process. While exploring his new Mammoth Cave, Morrison stumbled upon this incredible formation called Frozen Niagara, a massive flowstone formation that was previously inaccessible from the main entrance.
So he was a showman, but he was also a legitimate explorer.
Yeah, I think that's what made him such a formidable competitor. He knew how to create buzz, how to draw in the crowds, but he was also genuinely passionate about exploring these underground worlds.
Sounds like a recipe for success, and probably a headache for his rivals.
Oh, absolutely. And this whole rivalry, this battle for supremacy in the Kentucky cave world, it takes a really dramatic turn with the story of Floyd Collins.
Yeah, Floyd Collins, that's where things get really intense. His story, I think, is a reminder that this wasn't just some friendly competition. There were real risks involved.
Absolutely. And the Floyd Collins tragedy really captured the nation's attention. It was a story that highlighted the dangers of this cutthroat competition, the allure of these underground worlds, and the lengths to which people were willing to go to explore them.
So who was Floyd Collins? Yeah, how did he end up entangled in this whole cave war drama?
Well, Floyd was a local guy, bit of a daredevil, always looking for the next big discovery. He had already developed Great Crystal Cave on his family's property, but it was kind of off the beaten path, not attracting as many visitors as he'd hoped.
So he was looking to hit it big, find something that would really put him on the map.
Exactly, and he thought he might have found it with Sand Cave. He teamed up with a neighbor to explore and develop it, hoping to find a connection to the Mammoth Cave system, which would have been a huge draw for tourists.
So he was in the thick of the cave wars, trying to make his mark, and then things took a turn for the worse.
They did. While exploring a narrow passage in Sand Cave, his lantern started to fail, and in the darkness, he dislodged a rock that pinned his ankle.
Oh no, that's terrifying.
It was, and to make matters worse, another rockfall trapped him even further.
So now he's stuck in the dark with a rock crushing his ankle. I'm already feeling claustrophobic just thinking about it.
It must have been absolutely terrifying for him. And what started as a local incident quickly became a national sensation.
Why is that? Why did this particular story capture so much attention?
Well, a couple of reasons. First, it was a story of human drama. A man trapped underground fighting for survival. People were naturally drawn to it. And this was also one of the first major news stories to unfold in real time. Reporters were sending updates via telegraph and radio, and people were glued to their newspapers and radios, following every twist and turn of the rescue efforts.
Wow, so it's like the first 24-hour news cycle, but for a cave rescue.
Exactly, and that constant media attention, while it helped raise awareness and support for the rescue, it also created this kind of frenzy, a spectacle that sometimes hampered the rescue efforts themselves.
So it's a story with so many layers, this clash of ambition, the power of the media, and at the heart of it, this very human struggle for survival.
Absolutely, and it's a story that really highlights the complex relationship we have with these underground worlds. They can be beautiful, they can be dangerous, they can be awe-inspiring and terrifying all at the same time.
And that's where we'll pick up in part 2. We'll delve deeper into the rescue efforts, the media frenzy surrounding the story, and the ultimately tragic fate of Floyd Collins.
It's a story you won't want to miss.
So stay tuned. So we left off with Floyd Collins trapped down in Sand Cave Right, a rock pinning his ankle, and the original entrance caved in.
Yeah, it was a dire situation, to say the least. And with each passing hour, the odds of rescuing him alive were dwindling.
And on top of that, you've got this media circus happening above ground, right?
Absolutely. The Floyd Collins tragedy, it became this national obsession.
Like folks couldn't get enough of it.
They couldn't. Reporters were filing stories, constantly telegraphing updates back to their newspapers. Radio bulletins were going out several times a day. It was everywhere.
I mean, I guess I get it. It's a gripping story, right?
It is. It's got all these elements, right? You've got the sense of danger, the unknown, the race against time, and then there's this element of hope, right? Will they be able to pull him out? Will he survive?
But all that media attention, didn't it kind of complicate the rescue efforts too?
Yeah, in some ways it did. I mean, you had all these reporters and photographers crowding around the cave entrance, jostling for position, trying to get the best shot, the most dramatic story.
And I imagine that didn't exactly create a calm and focused environment for the rescuers.
It didn't. I mean, they're trying to work quickly and carefully to free Collins. They've got all these distractions, all this pressure, and the media sometimes they sensationalize things, they exaggerated details, or even outright fabricated stories to make things more exciting.
Oh, wow. So they were basically adding to the chaos.
They were, and it wasn't just the media. There were also all sorts of rumors and speculation flying around. Some people even claim that the whole thing was a hoax.
A hoax. Like they thought Collins was faking the whole thing?
Yeah, can you believe that? Some folks thought he was just trying to drum up publicity for his cave.
It's hard to believe that people would be so cynical in the face of such a dire situation.
It is. And these rumors, they actually got so bad that the military even launched an investigation.
Really? The military?
Yeah, a full-blown court of inquiry to determine if Collins' entrapment was genuine or some elaborate publicity stunt.
So they had to pause the rescue efforts while they investigated this.
They did, and while they ultimately concluded that Collins was indeed trapped those lost days, they were crucial.
I can't even imagine what must have been going through Collins' mind during all this, right?
It must have been agonizing, trapped down there in the dark, injured cold, and all this drama unfolding above ground.
And then there's the added layer of knowing that your fate is basically being debated in the public sphere, right? Are you a genuine victim or are you a fraud?
It's heartbreaking to think about, and as the days turned into weeks, the rescuers, they were working tirelessly, right? They were trying to dig a new shaft to reach him. They brought him food and water, even strung up electric lights down there to give him some comfort.
So they were able to reach him at least for a while.
They were, but then another collapse occurred, blocking the new shaft, making the rescue even more difficult.
So they were so close yet so far.
Exactly, and after weeks of agonizing effort, the rescuers, they finally reached the chamber where Collins was trapped.
What did they find?
Tragically, they found Floyd Collins dead. He'd likely succumbed to exposure and dehydration days earlier.
That's just awful. After all that effort, all the hope, all the media attention, it ended in tragedy.
It did. It was a devastating blow for everyone involved, a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the unforgiving nature of those underground worlds.
So what happened next? What became of Floyd Collins?
Well, initially, his family decided to leave his body in the cave. They sealed up the rescue shaft as his tomb. It seemed like a fitting end in a way, leaving him to rest in the place that had captured his imagination and ultimately claimed his life.
It does have a certain poetic symmetry to it.
It does. But just a few months later, they decided to move his body. They embalmed him and reburied him on the family property near Crystal Cave.
It seems like they wanted to bring him closer to home.
I think so, but even in death, Floyd Collins couldn't escape the shadow of the cave wars.
What do you mean?
Well, a few years later, the family, they sold Crystal Cave to a man named Dr. Harry Thomas. And Dr. Thomas, he was always a showman, a bit of an entrepreneur, and he had a different vision for Floyd Collins.
Oh, this doesn't sound good.
It wasn't.
All right.
He exhumed Collins's body, placed it in a glass-topped coffin, and put it on display inside Crystal Cave as a tourist attraction.
You're kidding, right? They turned him into an exhibit.
They did. It's hard to fathom now, isn't it? This blatant exploitation of a tragedy.
It's sickening to think that people would actually pay money to see that.
It was a gruesome spectacle, and thankfully it didn't last. When the National Park Service acquired Crystal Cave as part of Mammoth Cave National Park, they put an end to the exhibit.
At least he was finally granted some dignity.
He was. And in 1989, after years of petitions from the Collins family, his body was moved to a proper burial site at Mammoth Cave Baptist Church, where he finally rests in peace.
That's good to hear. It's just astounding to me how even in death he became a pawn in this whole Cave Wars saga.
It really is, and it speaks to the kind of moral ambiguity of that era, the way that profit and spectacle often overshadowed human decency.
And it's a reminder that the creation of Mammoth Cave National Park, while ultimately a victory for conservation, came at a cost for many local residents.
It did. Creating the park meant acquiring over 45,000 acres from hundreds of landowners.
I imagine a lot of those folks weren't exactly thrilled about being uprooted.
You're right. Many of them had deep ties to the land. Their families had lived there for generations, and they were fiercely resistant to selling.
And it wasn't just about selling a piece of property, right? It was about losing a way of life, a connection to their history.
Exactly. And for many Black residents, this displacement was compounded by the realities of racial discrimination. They faced unfair compensation for their land and struggled to rebuild their lives elsewhere.
It's a sobering reminder that even well-intentioned progress can have unintended consequences.
It can, and it's important to acknowledge those consequences, to remember the human cost of these grand conservation efforts.
So the creation of the park was a double-edged sword, in a way, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another, with both positive and negative ramifications.
Exactly, and it's a legacy that we're still grappling with today.
We tend to romanticize the past, right? But
Yeah.
the Kentucky Cave Wars, they remind us that progress isn't always pretty.
It isn't, and it's often messy and complicated.
Yeah. And it's a reminder that we need to be mindful of the impact of our actions, both on the environment and on the people who call these places home.
Absolutely well said.
We've been exploring the Kentucky Cave Wars, this fascinating and, at times, kind of disturbing chapter of American history.
Yeah, it's a story that really grabs you, doesn't it?
It does. We've seen the beauty of Mammoth Caves, the fierce competition between these rival cave owners, and the tragic story of Floyd Collins.
A story that really highlights the risks and the allure of these underground worlds.
Definitely. And we've talked about how the creation of Mammoth Cave National Park brought an end to the cave wars, but we also touched on how it came with a cost for a lot of local residents.
It did. Creating the park meant acquiring land from hundreds of landowners, many of whom had deep roots in the area.
And I imagine for a lot of those families, it wasn't an easy decision to sell.
No, not at all. For many, it was a heartbreaking experience, leaving behind land that their families had farmed for generations.
Land that held so much history, so much meaning for them.
Exactly, and the government offered compensation, but for many, it wasn't enough to replace what they had lost, that sense of connection to the land, to their heritage.
It's easy to get caught up in the big picture of conservation, but it's important to remember the individual stories, the human cost of these kinds of efforts.
Absolutely. And in this case, the burden fell disproportionately on those who were already marginalized. Black residents often faced discrimination in the compensation process and struggled to find new homes and opportunities elsewhere.
It's a reminder that progress, even when it's well-intentioned, can have unintended consequences.
And those consequences often impact the most vulnerable members of society.
It makes you think, doesn't it? Like, how do we balance the need for conservation with the rights and well-being of the people who live in these areas?
It's a complex issue, and there's no easy answer, but it's a question we need to keep asking ourselves.
So the legacy of the Kentucky Cave Wars is complicated, right?
Right.
It's a story of greed and exploitation, but also of human ingenuity, resilience, and ultimately, I think, a growing awareness of the importance of preserving our natural wonders.
I think that's a good way to put it. It's a story with a lot of layers, a lot of lessons to be learned.
It's a story that reminds us that we need to be responsible stewards of the environment, that we need to be mindful of the impact of our actions.
And that we need to find ways to ensure that everyone benefits from conservation efforts, not just a select few.
So the Kentucky Cave Wars, they might be over, but the lessons we can learn from them, they're still relevant today.
They are. They remind us of the power of these natural wonders, the importance of protecting them, but also the need to do so in a way that's fair and equitable for all.
We've explored this fascinating chapter of history together, and I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the Kentucky Cave Wars.
It's been a pleasure sharing these stories with you.
If you're interested in learning more about Mammoth Cave or the history of the region, we'll be sure to include some links in the show notes.
And we'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode. What resonated with you? What questions do you still have?
Join us again next time as we unearth another intriguing piece of history and explore the lessons it holds for us today.